Hello. Okay, we'll start in a few minutes. I was going to screen a film, but I'm actually going to talk about one of the aspects of the readings, and I'm going to talk about cases of alleged sterilization of Indigenous women, and I'm going to talk about it in historical terms, because Canada, like other countries, has a long history of passing different policies regarding abortion, reproduction, and sterilization. So I'll discuss that today. And there's some questions, I guess, about the test. So I'll use the chat function. There will be a take-home test, and I will post the questions online, and then you will have 1 week to answer the questions. So if I look at the syllabus, the take-home test will be distributed on January 30th. And due on February 7th. So there are 2 more assignments after this. In March, you are asked to give a presentation. You can present during this synchronous lecture hour. You can also record a presentation and upload it on Blackboard. And the presentation is due on March 6th. And then finally, there's a final assignment, and that's due on April, the last class, April 3rd. So I will upload the guidelines for the presentation, the final assignment, next week. So you'll have lots of time to work on it. The presentation should only be, well, it can be a minimum of 10 minutes, and there's no maximum time. And you can present in this time period, or you can just record a presentation. And the presentation assignment asks you to choose one aspect of the readings, and then or it asks you to choose 1 week's readings and discuss an issue or discuss a theoretical concept from the readings. So for example, you could choose one of the articles that we've looked at written by Shireen Razak that focuses on the freezing deaths, which are also called the Starlight Tours, and police violence against Indigenous youth. And you could look at the issue of policing broadly. You could also discuss some of the concepts that Shireen Razak uses regarding colonialism and post-colonialism. The point is that you are asked to just do a presentation that demonstrates that you have done the reading and also formulated an original thesis regarding the reading. What is MCQ? I'm not sure what MCQ is. Oh, no, the test is short answer. You will be asked to define concepts from the reading thus far. So you will be given a choice of concepts to define, like social solidarity, gender and disposability, homo sacer. These are all concepts from the reading. So you will be given a choice, and then you will have to define 5 concepts, 4 or 5, I'm not sure yet. I think 5 concepts from, and you will be given, say, a list of 8 concepts, and you will be asked to give a short answer definition of 5 from the reading. It will also be a take-home, so you don't have to memorize these concepts. You can take the time, take the week after the test has been posted on Blackboard and look at the readings in PowerPoints. The point of the test is to just ask you to engage with the course reading. And the presentation also asks you to look at one of the readings in detail. The final assignment will be an essay, and so you will be asked to answer an essay question. You will also be given the option of designing your own essay or creating your own topic, as long as it relates to Indigenous issues. We have looked so far at the first week's readings look specifically at Indigenous issues, but the last class we talked about the pandemic, and I put an article on the syllabus specifically looking at Emil Durkheim's writings and how they relate to the pandemic. And so there are broad issues like inequality in the global pandemic that do relate to Indigenous issues. And this is also true of feminist theory and sociological theories of Marxism, of inequality, of class antagonism, theories of racism that we'll discuss throughout the class that I will try to contextualize in relation to Indigenous issues. So some of the articles on the syllabus specifically discuss Indigenous issues explicitly. Other articles are theoretical articles like Ashili Mbembe's writings regarding necropolitics, which I will explain and contextualize, making reference to Indigenous issues in Canada. So I will share my screen. So I will discuss obstetric violence in this lecture. And obstetric violence is a term that has been used by feminist theorists for some time to discuss debates regarding abortion, sterilization, and control over reproduction. And so, as with the last class, I will discuss a broad issue like obstetric violence and reproductive justice, and then I will contextualize it in relation to specific examples regarding Indigenous women historically in Canada. So, the practice of sterilization arose out of the eugenics movement and has a long, often hidden history in Canada. Sterilization legislation in Alberta from 1928 to 1972 and British Columbia from 1933 to 1973 attempted to limit the reproduction of unfit persons and increasingly targeted Indigenous women. Coerced sterilization of Indigenous women took place within and outside existing legislation and in Indian hospitals. The practice has continued into the 21st century. Approximately 100 Indigenous women have alleged that they were pressured to consent to sterilization between the 1970s and 2018, often while in vulnerable states of pregnancy or childbirth. So the history of sterilization of Indigenous women is well documented in Canadian history throughout Canada in every province. And this coercion, the coerced sterilization took place within and outside of existing laws. So, irrespective of the passage of law, sterilization of Indigenous women has continued in Canada, and there are now a series of class action lawsuits, which I discussed during the first lecture, which the federal government of Canada and Supreme Court of Canada will have to hear, and they are lawsuits that were filed by Indigenous women throughout Canada, alleging that nurses and doctors have coerced Indigenous women to be sterilized after they had one pregnancy or one child, and also actually forcing Indigenous women to be sterilized against their will. The conditions or the kind of material violence used by the healthcare system has also been well documented. So the actual burning of a fallopian tube in Regina has been documented, and this kind of invasive medicine is often coupled by a kind of ongoing commentary by nurses and doctors regarding Indigenous women's bodies. And I discussed this in the first class when we talked about the murder of Cindy Glatu and the use of language by people in the criminal justice system who must constantly use terms like native or native prostitute, native girl to refer to Cindy Gladue, and this has also been true in these cases of alleged sterilization, where the use of language against Indigenous women who are in the most vulnerable position after having given birth is consistent. It is the same pattern of behavior. The kind of even tone of voice that is used is really disturbing and often involves almost a kind of sneering or mockery. Um, Racism in these cases, and in the case of Cindy Gladue, is not just about discrimination or a refusal of services. It is about a real aggression towards Indigenous women, a real debasement of the lives of Indigenous women and their bodies. There is a sense of real aggression, and it is almost Nazi-like or fascist, as it involves not only the desire to, say, exclude or discriminate in economic terms, but to actually enact what is referred to in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report as genocide. So the report clearly argues that Canada is undertaking an ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples, which is why the violence against Indigenous women is so aggressive and unrelenting. The report is controversial, and many people who are part of the public and media in Canada debated the use of the term genocide. However, the report was compiled by academics and scholars who spent years conducting qualitative and quantitative research regarding the murder of Indigenous women and girls and cases of missing persons as well. And the report looks at police negligence. It also looks at the educational system and healthcare system and attitudes that the general public has towards Indigenous people and specifically Indigenous women and girls throughout Canada. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report argues that genocide is not only enacted through direct acts of killing or through prevention of birth. It is also a form of cultural genocide. So the report looks at the ways that the destruction of Indigenous languages over generations, the refusal to name streets or buildings after Indigenous peoples, the refusal to have any monuments or any kind of public displays or public forms of commemoration of Indigenous peoples is all a form of genocide. So the erasure of symbols and language is central to genocide. And in most acts of ethnic cleansing throughout the world and historically, removing symbols of, say, religious minorities, trying to erase a language, trying to actually remove the images of people from media, from art galleries, from public space is all a way of enacting ethnic cleansing against a population. So the report looks at all of these actions that have taken place historically, and it also looks at ways to redress or to remedy this behavior. Sterilization is one of the most obvious and violent ways that the Canadian state has tried to enact or tried to enact ethnic cleansing against Indigenous peoples. So the language of ethnic cleansing is also used by the report, which was funded and released by the federal government of Canada. And the seriousness of these terms, ethnic cleansing, genocide, is important, as the report is not just meant to document this ongoing violence, but to offer comprehensive information regarding extreme violations of international law that must be addressed by all of Canada's institutions. And if the report is not taken seriously, then Canada is essentially violating international law and will have to face sanctions from the United Nations. So ethnic cleansing is the systematic forced removal of ethnic, racial, or religious groups from a given area with the intent of making the society ethnically homogeneous, along with direct removal such as deportation or population transfer. It also includes indirect methods aimed at forced migration by coercing the victim group to flee and preventing its return, such as murder, rape, and property destruction. Both the definition and charge of ethnic cleansing is often disputed, with some researchers including and others excluding coercive assimilation or mass killing as a means of depopulating an area of a particular group. So the Indian Act is discussed in detail in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Report, Indigenous Women and Girls Report, and the Indian Act is discussed in the TRC report, Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. And the Indian Act really sought to intervene into Indigenous people's lives, marital choices, reproductive choices, as a means of seizing land specifically from Indigenous women. So the Indian Act has been referred to by feminist scholars as an effort to turn matrifocal and matrilineal cultures into patriarchal cultures, where titles of land and name would be passed through cisgender, heterosexual male patriarchs rather than women. So the control over women and who Indigenous women have children with, and how many children Indigenous women have has been central to colonization. The coerced sterilization of Indigenous women allows the state to deny responsibility for and avoid doing something about the often deplorable social, economic, and health conditions in most Indigenous communities, conditions that the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples recognized as being a direct result of dispossession and colonialism. It is more cost-effective to limit the ability of Indigenous women to reproduce than it is to do what is required to improve the conditions into which children are born. So this is really a eugenic strategy, and I mean, Indigenous people are not the only group of racialized minorities who whose childbirth and reproductive capacity has been attacked by the state. So there is a long history of what could be termed obstetric violence against Black American women, specifically in certain states in the United States of America. Globally, women in India, women in the global South have often been subject to forced sterilization because of imagined poverty and because of a lack of willingness to yes, people with disabilities as well. Eugenics, in its most extreme, eugenics was used by the Nazis, and people with disabilities were prevented from having children. And even from full participation in society. So this idea of who is fit or unfit is central to eugenics. But what is also central in the modern period is money. So the justification for modern eugenics is often that certain populations of people, like poor women in the global South or women who live in working class neighborhoods, cannot afford to have children. So rather than offering a social welfare state model that would offer more financial support for working class and poor mothers, eugenics intervenes into the lives of the poor in really violent ways. So when understood within this context, coerced sterilization of Indigenous women can be viewed as an act of genocide or an attempt to undermine the ability of a group to exist. So forced sterilization is not specific to Canada. It exists throughout the world, and specifically Indigenous rights activists and authors have documented the ways that Indigenous people in Peru and Indonesia have also been the target of sterilization and coerced contraception policies. And one could argue that there is an ideological function. So the Marxist concept of ideology is really about belief, that one really believes that certain groups are, say, superior to others. And for Marx, this concept of ideology is really about class, that people who are rich or born into rich families might believe that they are better. And it is possible, if we believe in kind of class hierarchy, that one could believe that the rich are superior to the poor, or people who are middle class are superior to the working class. And this is capitalist ideology. It is possible that there is an ideology of settler superiority, and that people who are part of, say, modern urban cities throughout the world think of themselves as being superior to the Indigenous, and this could justify sterilization. What is also probable is that Indigenous peoples are often perceived of as poor, and as people who might not have the economic means to have more than one child, and therefore the state is enacting this kind of obstetric violence against Indigenous peoples, Indigenous women, because they're perceived of as poor. The full extent of reproductive control practices around the world is not known, but they have been historically and continue to be targeted at Indigenous, poor, and migrant women, according to principal investigator Denise Spitzer, professor in the School of Public Health and former Canada Research Chair in Gender, Migration, and Health. So Josie Auger is associate professor at Athabasca University and author of My People's Blood, Indigenous Sexual Health Recovery. And Auger states this non-consensual control over a woman's reproduction is a continuum of colonial violence, whether it's part of the past or the times that we're in now. Indigenous peoples who are vulnerable and marginalized are looked at as the other, and over time have been institutionalized in prisons, Indian hospitals, and mental institutions, where such practices have been carried out. So this again is interesting, and thank you for your comment regarding people with disabilities and sterilization, because the kind of violence against Indigenous women throughout the world often involves this kind of overlapping between poverty or between class antagonism or classism and racism and also ableism. So the construction of Indigenous women as having, say, mental health issues or having poor health or being disabled intersects with systemic racism and sexism and classism, and then allows the state to justify sterilization or reproductive violence or control because of the normalization of all of these processes like ableism and also racism and classism. So I would argue that in this time period, wealth and being rich, having money is so important that one can justify actually committing atrocities against the poor. So in the same way that housing security is often not guaranteed, and it's possible for people who are poor, homeless, to die on the streets in very cold weather because they don't have money, it is also possible for national governments throughout the world to justify sterilizing the poor. And this kind of reproductive violence has always been present. It is specifically in the 1990s that neoliberalism allows for the kind of cult of the individual who is not guaranteed anything but is free to sell their labor. So neoliberalism refers to new. Neo is kind of another way of saying new, and liberalism, which means liberal policies regarding capitalism, so the free market. So at any time you can log on the internet and you can sell your labor. You can sell your labor in any country in the world, even as long as you have permission to do so. But the kind of protection of industry and the economy is removed. So it's a kind of new liberal market. The problem is that this neoliberal turn replaces the social welfare state model. So you are not guaranteed housing or education for free or work as a citizen. You must constantly keep trying to sell your labor. You must constantly keep trying to find housing security, job security, food security. You are not really guaranteed anything. And Canada does have a social welfare state, and it is a more well developed social welfare state than other contexts. However, there has still been what critics would call a rolling back of the social welfare state model in exchange for neoliberalism. What this means is that people can have children and they can get some benefits. However, um, the majority of capital and time that it will take to raise children will be a burden on the parents, or will be a responsibility that parents are asked to take on, or asked to fulfill, um, without help from the state. So the problem becomes that if one is poor or precariously housed, they will be asked to use their own private capital to take care of children. And there becomes this kind of full circle then of, on the one hand, the state not taking responsibility for reproduction and for childcare, and then the state that criminalizing people who are poor, and arguing that they should not have uh, large families because of their class position. So I'll discuss obstetric violence, gender, and power. Then I will talk about race, class, and the baby. Then colonialism, sex, and the family. And fourthly, sterilization and the law. So hopefully we'll have time to discuss all 4 points. If not, I will talk about them again next week. And we'll look at more of the readings from the syllabus. Firstly, I'll discuss childbirth and obstetric violence. Childbirth is something that feminist theorists have written about for an extensive amount of time, and there is a massive kind of body of scholarship regarding childbirth. If you start to research all of the writings regarding childbirth and obstetrics, it is extensive, and writings regarding childbirth cross all disciplines, including the law, obviously medicine, um, literature, writings regarding migration and citizenship often discuss childbirth, and writings regarding religion and race. All of these kind of disciplines and subdisciplines discuss childbirth. So if you are interested in doing a master's degree after your undergrad studies, you might think about writing about obstetrics and looking at childbirth in Canada and the ways that childbirth itself is perhaps always thought of in relation to colonization. So post-colonial theorists like Anaya Lumba and other well-cited post-colonial scholars would argue that colonialism exists in a self-other binary. Colonialism produces, but is perhaps also productive of this self-other binary. What this means is that a settler knows oneself or herself or their selves in relation to the colonized person, to the indigenous peoples. And so Canadian settlers are often constructed as certain types of people in relation to Indigenous peoples. So, childbirth in Canada is never innocent. It should always be thought of in relation to histories of colonization. Childbirth and race, childbirth and class, childbirth and age, childbirth and the geography of Canada can all be thought of in relation to the history of colonization of Indigenous peoples and the history of sterilization. So Adrienne Rich writes, as long as birth, metaphorically or literally, remains an experience of passively handing over our minds and our bodies to male authority and technology, other kinds of social change can only minimally change our relationship to ourselves, to power, and to the world outside our bodies. So Adrienne Rich wrote extensively about queerness and feminism, and also about male authority. And Rich is really critical of the ways that childbirth is an experience that often involves male authority over women's bodies, which then leads to this concept which Sara Cohen Shabot discusses, obstetric violence. So Cohen Shabot writes, I offer a philosophical analysis focusing on how obstetric violence is lived and experienced by women, and why it is frequently described in terms not only of violence in general, but of gender violence specifically, violence directed at women because they are women. Feminist phenomenology is useful in explaining and accounting for the feelings that many victims of this violence, including myself, writes Cohen Shabot, experience and report, including feelings of embodied oppression, the diminishment of self, and physical and emotional infantilization. Feminist phenomenology offers crucial insights into how and why this phenomenon differs from other types of medical violence, objectification, and reification. So phenomenology is a term from Merleau-Ponty, and Merleau-Ponty is a French philosopher who argues that phenomenology is perhaps more important than objectivity, and phenomenology is really the study of feeling, how we feel or experience something, and Merleau-Ponty was interested in how our experiences and our feelings really shape knowledge production and our understanding of the world. And social phenomenon can be thought of in relation to this philosophy of experience. So phenomenology argues that the ultimate source of all meaning and value is the lived experience of human beings. So all philosophical systems or aesthetic judgments have the status of abstractions from the ebb and flow of the lived world. So rather than thinking of objectivity, phenomenologists are interested in experience as the source of meaning and source of knowledge. So Cohen Shabot cites Iris Marion Young's description of the feminine existence under patriarchy as conformed by a perpetual oppressive I cannot, illuminates my attempt to understand the laboring body, as often deeply jeopardizing how femininity is performed and thereby seriously threatening patriarchal power. Rape is also central to obstetric violence. So The rape of Indigenous women has also been well documented in Canadian history, and there is this kind of blurring between poverty, labor exploitation, forced or coerced sex work, and rape in the lives of and in the kind of enactment of violence against Indigenous women. Obstetric violence is a feminist issue, writes Cohen Shabot, and must first be examined through feminist views on violence, directed at women or even more marginalized gender groups, such as birthing transgenders, and part of a general patriarchal oppression of women and other others. Obstetric violence constitutes a case of gender violence. It is a clearly gendered phenomenon. Women are its main victims, and it has its origins primarily in how women and other how women and their disabilities are perceived and perceive themselves in Western patriarchal societies. Another reason to analyze this kind of violence separately from other kinds of medical violence, even those directed specifically at women, is that the laboring body most often constitutes a healthy, powerful body that has much more in common with the dancing, running, or erotic body than it does with the pathological body in need of cure and healing. The laboring experience also appears to be deeply sexual. One reason why obstetric violence is interpreted by some women as nothing less than rape. So, obstetric violence then often constructs women as being people who are ill or pathological in need of cure and healing. And obstetric violence often targets women who are pregnant or seeking abortions as being supposedly sick or ill rather than thinking of women's sexual agency and choice. This sexual dimension and the use of the language of rape in this context is another strong justification for using feminist phenomenology to understand and account for obstetric violence. So, what Cohen, Shabot, and other scholars would argue is that the medical system and its use of both forced and coercive sterilization and the refusal to allow women to have an abortion are essentially violating women's right to choice. And by extension, the refusal to allow someone to have an abortion or the control over their capacity to give birth can be thought of on a continuum with rape and sexual violence. And this is the argument that the author makes. So Cohen Shabbat discusses this desire to tame the body by obstetrics. And this kind of taming of the body could be thought of in multiple ways. Firstly, taming the body that wants to give birth or wants to have the choice to give birth through sterilization, but also taming the body that wants an abortion. Using Jung's ideas about how women's bodies are constructed in Western patriarchal societies as disabled bodies in themselves, naturally or essentially handicapped, deprived of the capacity to move freely and securely in space, banned in Merleau-Ponty's words from the possibility of haunting space. I show that obstetric violence appears as a tool for taming a rebelling body, for putting a feminine body in its place, if it challenges its femininity, its condition as object, through a loud and subversive embodied subjectivity. This raises interesting questions, including the paradox of women's recognition of their bodies, both as naturally or a priori disabled and as capable and powerful. If obstetric violence only keeps women in the same reduced, disabled, dependent situation they already occupy, and that they recognize and internalize as intimately theirs, why do so many women nevertheless recognize, identify, and experience obstetric violence as violence, a diminishment and banishment of an otherwise authentic, powerful, and embodied self? So, this kind of paradox of the construction of the body as being sick or in need, but also as being capable and powerful, is central to obstetric violence. That when medical doctors want to seize upon a body that cannot give birth, in cases of sterilization of women, they do, and the body that cannot give birth is seen to be sick or poor and therefore not deserving of the right to give birth. When the medical establishment or lawyers who kind of are obsessed with banning abortion want to argue that the body can always give birth, they ban abortion. So this kind of capability of women to always give birth at any time justifies the banning of abortion, but the refusal to see certain women as being capable of giving birth because they are poor or because they are imagined to be unhealthy or unfit to have children is also a form of obstetric violence. In both cases, the authority is not with the woman herself, but with lawmakers, the medical establishment, patriarchal and abusive men, or family members, religious authorities, cultural groups, the state. All of these people claim authority over someone else's body. More and more studies are being done on the pervasiveness of obstetric practices that are not evidence-based, do not improve medical outcomes, and are performed on women in labor without their explicit consent, sometimes even over their explicit refusal. These studies demonstrate a clear relation between these interventions and the presence of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, in new mothers. Fernandez summarizes many of these studies, showing how traumatic births, as defined by mothers themselves, usually result from dehumanizing treatment of mothers by the medical authorities in charge, often involving depriving women of any agency or control during labor. Women report feeling forced to undergo interventions without being truly informed about the processes and consequences. They feel disrespected and uncared for. The feeling of abuse these women report can be at least partially explained by the process of being transformed from a leb, a living body, infused with freedom and the possibility of transcendence, into a corpor, a passive body object with no embodied agency and no possibility of active engagement with the world. So this traumatic birth is also about race and racialization, and it is obvious in the history of sterilization of Indigenous women in settler Canada, that race is what makes birth often traumatic for Indigenous women. And this is also true of Black women, women of color, immigrant women, and women in the global South, that the trauma is actually about an ongoing process of genocide and the desire on the part of conservative medical people and the state itself to not have any more births of those who are not the wealthiest and most privileged people. So race, class is, race and class is, I think, one of the most obvious examples of how race and class continues to structure institutions in really discriminatory ways is childbirth. Racial justice scholars and advocates have modeled how and why it is necessary to track how expert claims are being made, who validates them, and how this shapes the knowledge environment. Among other strategies to challenge racial inequality, race scholars and racial justice activists have challenged the scientific and medical research and questioned the tools that have long been used to rationalize and naturalize racial difference. So this article was written by Aziza Ahmed in the the Boston University School of Law, and it's in the Yale Journal of Law and Feminism. And Aziza Ahmed wrote this article after the Dobbs ruling, which banned abortion in many states throughout the United States of America. Taking on medical practice and technologies have required racial justice scholars and advocates to unearth the assumptions and politics that are embedded in medical care. These past few years, a few medical tools have come under intense scrutiny from racial justice scholars and advocates, including the vaginal birth after a cesarean calculator, lung spirometer, pulse oximeter, and the EGFR score. And this is the formula for calculating who should receive a kidney transplant. Each of these tools contained with them a, quote, race correction, allowing for an adjustment in test outcomes based on race, with implications for further testing and treatment. So the use of race has always been central to medicine, and medical racism continues. During the global pandemic, a lot of the testing procedures, the ways, for example, that one looked for skin that was red as an indicator of somebody who had COVID-19 obviously discriminated against people of color whose skin could not go red in the same way. And this was often one of the ways that the tools that were used to measure COVID-19 were highly discriminated, and people of color could perhaps have had COVID-19 and been misdiagnosed. So this kind of medical racism continues all the time in every area of life, including childbirth and reproductive rights, or regarding issues of reproduction. So for reproductive rights advocates, like racial justice advocates, this might include continued advocacy at administrative agencies, challenging technocratic and scientific assertions, and watching for new scientific claims around abortion as they emerge and are validated by the courts. Reproductive rights advocates can learn from ongoing activism of racial justice advocates in tracking shifts in the scientific knowledge environments around race. This is especially so as reproductive rights advocacy must now take on a new and ever-shifting scientific, legal, and political landscape in the post-Dobbs moment, writes Aziza Ahmed. So the effects that the banning of abortion will have on people in the United States of America are obviously unequal and determined by the existing politics of race and class and the history of the transatlantic slave trade, immigration, refugee claims, and settler colonialism. So the Dobbs ruling overturned Roe versus Wade throughout the United States of America, throughout many states. And Aziza Ahmed discusses the Dobbs ruling and its relationship to race and law in this essay. And others have argued or have discussed the ways that the criminalization of abortion has increased the prevalence of unsafe abortions, and specifically among women of color, poor women, and migrant women. So Zoe L. Tung discusses the Dobbs ruling after the first year. So Tung discusses or tries to document what happened after the first year. So Zoe Tung writes, L. Tung writes, on the 24th of June, 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the constitutional right to abortion established in Roe v. Wade 50 years ago, paving the way for harsher restrictions on abortion in many states. The criminalization of abortion increases the prevalence of unsafe abortions, creating risks to pregnant people's health as well as of prosecution. 1 year on, this post looks at the impact of abortion bans in the U.S. And so Zoe L. Tung has discussed the impact that the Dobbs ruling has had. So in June 2022, in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the constitutional protection for pre-viability abortion confirmed in Roe versus Wade in 1973. This did not come as a shock. Justice Alito's draft judgment had already been leaked some months before. The impact on access to abortion in the U.S. has been significant. 13 states had trigger laws in place to come into effect as soon as Roe was overturned. Some of these restrictions have left abortion almost entirely prohibited. In Texas, for example, abortion is illegal once fetal cardiac activity is detectable, limiting abortion beyond six weeks gestation. In the 2 months following the Dobbs decision, the estimated number of legal abortions across the U.S. dropped by around 10,000. In 2022, 42 independent abortion clinics across the U.S. were forced to close, including the Jackson Women's Health Organization, the Mississippi Clinic, which was involved in the Michael Dobbs case. As of April 2023, 7 more states have attempted to restrict access to abortion. Feminist scholars have long connected the criminalization of abortion to unsafe abortion, along with maternal mortality and morbidity rates. While human rights bodies have recommended that governments decriminalize abortion for this reason. So Aziza Ahmed discusses mental health and abortion and people with disabilities and abortion in this essay, which is which is published in the Yale Journal of Law and Feminism. So the creation of this condition was the result of a very successful move by anti-abortion advocates who utilized disproven studies to help pass informed consent laws. So Ahmed discusses the ways that highly selective information regarding medicine was used to justify the banning of abortion in the Dobbs ruling. These advocates have stayed the course. Since Dobbs, for example, prosecutors in Michigan considered whether they should prosecute providers under a 1931 abortion ban that was still on the books. The governor of Michigan sought and was awarded a temporary restraining order against the application of the law. Support for the law came from a variety of places, including testimony provided by Priscilla Coleman, who frequently writes and publishes on the issue of mental health and abortion. Drawing on her research, whose claims have been questioned time and again by leading researchers, she testified that abortion causes various forms of mental health distress, and therefore the law should be in effect. Though the court discredited the testimony and placed a temporary restraining order on the law, in many other cases, similar assertions have led to the passage of informed consent laws that require physicians to give incorrect information to patients about abortion. "21 states ban abortion or restrict the procedure earlier in pregnancy than the standard set by Roe v. Wade, which govern reproductive rights for nearly half a century until the Supreme Court overturned the decision last year. In many states, the fight over abortion access is still taking place in courtrooms where advocates have sued to block bans and restrictions. Other states have moved to expand access to abortion by adding legal protections. So the Ahmed article discusses the ways that abortion bans also create a context of coercion, where the banning of abortion throughout all of these states in the United States of America also creates a context in which people can be coerced to have children. So the idea of choice is something that is central, and it's centrally debated within the Western feminist canon. So who has choices and what kind of agency we have is obviously always a question of relative freedom and power. So the choices we make to live in certain cities, for example, are obviously not really free choices. They involve economic questions or questions of access to money, to visas. Similarly, the choice to have children or not is obviously a choice that is about money and about power. Also a choice that is made in the context of histories of slavery, racism, and colonization. So after all, as John Stuart Mill pointed out more than 100 years ago, the pressures of socialization are so pervasive that we cannot know what women would be like in their absence. Indeed, much feminist energy has been expended in showing how philosophers' assertions about women's nature fails to notice the ways it is socially constructed. And since 1977, we have been armed with Christine Pierce's wonderful typology of appeals to nature. So, abortion is a really an ongoing, tangential, or controversial issue throughout the world. Abortion in Ireland um, has always been controversial because of nationalism and religious violence and ethnic cleansing. I would argue that abortion always becomes really controversial in context of ethnic cleansing, that issues of race and um, racial superiority and inferiority make childbirth really controversial and often violent. So Savita Halappanavar was a woman who died trying to have an abortion in Ireland. Savita Halappanavar's death deeply shocked the Irish society, and this article was written by Ronit Lenton, and it's called "A Woman Died." And Lenton states, "My argument is that beyond being a woman who unnecessarily died in childbirth in post-Catholic patriarchy, Halappanavar was a migrant woman whose death requires theorizing the Republic of Ireland as a gendered racial state." And so Halappanavar had sepsis and required an abortion to stay alive. And the doctor in the hospital stated that Ireland is a Catholic country. And so, therefore, Halappanavar was denied an abortion and she died. On the one hand, her death led to renewed demands for the promised legislation regarding the unequal weight of the lives of the unborn, the mother, as voted for in a 1983 constitutional referendum. On the other, strengthened Ireland's pro-life movement's resolve to oppose any legalization for abortion. Interrogating the politics of birth in Ireland, this paper argues that abortion is central to the construction of contemporary Irish identities. Halappanavar's case within the broader narrative of women's reproductive functions in Ireland, and within the recent history of casting migrant women's birthing practices as threatening the integrity of citizenship. So I would argue that the media and mainstream conservative commentary has often presented in the last 10 years, there's often presented this narrative of women who really want to have children and men who must kind of be asked to claim paternity by these women who are really interested in having children. In reality, if you look at the research throughout the world, there are more contexts where women are forced to have children against their will, and where women are often forced to marry and impregnated at a young age and then forced to give birth and take care of children. And this is much more common than women who really want to have children and cannot. So, racism was central to the murder of Savita Halappanavar in Ireland. Ireland has a long history of pitching good Catholic married mothers versus bad unmarried mothers. However, Savita Halappanavar died not merely as a woman whose reproductive practices are controlled by Irish patriarchy, but as a migrant woman whose body is othered, as emerged from the debates around the citizenship referendum. So Ireland is a really interesting case because citizenship is obviously connected to immigration. And this is also true in Canada and throughout the world, that having a child is also about migrants and the rights of migrants to give birth to children. but also the rights of migrants to have abortions. So again, this kind of dual process of control, trying to prevent certain women from ever giving birth again or ever at all, and trying to stop women from having abortions, is also clear in the migrant justice movement in Ireland. That on the one hand, Ireland is depicted as a white Catholic country, so there is kind of a real fetishization of the birth of white Catholic children to white Catholic mothers. And there's often a refusal to offer proper care or concern to other mothers or to other women who are not thought to be desirable partners or mothers because of racism and religious violence in Ireland. On the other hand, migrant women have the right to have abortions. However, because of patterns of immigration, there are instances where migrant women in Ireland are often religious minorities who live in um, enclosed ethnic communities where men often have sponsored them as dependents. And so when one is sponsored as a dependent, as say a woman from Pakistan or India, um, Bangladesh to Ireland, then you are sponsored as a wife. And so if you want to have an abortion, do you really have the right to choose? If you were to have an abortion as a free person or as a person who has your own passport, yes, you can have an abortion. But when you have been sponsored and you live in your husband's home or your in-laws' home, do you really have the choice? What would happen if you did have an abortion? What would the consequences be? So these are questions that migrant justice and feminist activists ask about abortion in Ireland. So colonialism is not just a process of land acquisition and capitalism. Colonialism is also a biopolitical project, and I believe that I've discussed biopolitics somewhat in the previous classes. Biopolitics is a way of governing and is a way that the state intervenes into all aspects of life. And it is a concept from Michel Foucault, whose lectures at the Collège Français discussed biopolitics and the ways that the state intervenes into obstetrics. And so biopolitics looks at state governance and the state's desire to control women and to control entire ethnic populations by controlling childbirth. So biopolitics then and the state's desire to control indigenous peoples were central to and are central to ongoing processes of colonialism. One could summarize in the above terms what Michel Foucault meant by biopower. So biopower is then that domain of life over which power has taken control. And the Canadian state then has consistently intervened into the bodies and lives of Indigenous women as a means of seizing biopolitical power over Indigenous peoples. So settler biopolitics then involves control over every aspect of Indigenous people's lives. And I would argue that biopolitics is really over-present. It's really kind of stark in the context of Canada and settler colonialism. The kind of real fixation that the Canadian state has on everything Indigenous people eat or drink or what languages they speak, and of course, childbirth is central to state powers or to the state's power over the indigenous. So, under what practical conditions is the right to kill, to allow to live, or to expose to death exercised? Who is the subject of this right? What does the implementation of such a right tell us about the person who is thus put to death, and about the relation of enmity that set that person against his or her murderer? Is the notion of biopower sufficient to account for the contemporary ways in which the political, under the guise of war, of resistance, or of the fight against terror, makes the murder of the enmity its primary and absolute objective? War, after all, is as much a means of achieving sovereignty as a way of exercising the right to kill. Imagining politics as a form of war, we must ask, what place is given to life, death, and the human body, in particular the wounded or slain body? How are they inscribed in the order of power? So I'll finish by discussing this concept of excess from George Bataille and Hegel. And it is a theoretical concept that I think is interesting in relation to this concept of, or in relation to obstetric violence and debates regarding reproduction. So first, George Bataille interprets death and sovereignty as the paroxysm of exchange and superabundance, or to use his own terminology, excess. For Bataille, life is defective only when death has taken it hostage. Life itself exists only in bursts and in exchange with death. He argues that death is the putrefaction of life, the stench that is at once the source and repulsive condition of life. And therefore, although it destroys what was to be, obliterates what was supposed to continue being, and reduces to nothing the individual who takes it, death does not come down to the annihilation of being. Second, George Bataille firmly anchors death in the realm of absolute expenditure, the other characteristic of sovereignty. Whereas Hegel tries to keep death within the economy of absolute knowledge and meaning. Life beyond utility, says Bataille, is the domain of sovereignty. This being the case, death is therefore the point at which destruction, suppression, and sacrifice constitute so irreversible and radical an expenditure without reserve, that they can no longer be determined as negativity. Death is therefore the very principle of excess, an anti-economy, hence the metaphor of luxury and the luxurious character of death. So, Bataille is interested in this idea of absolute expenditure and the ways that the state is interested not only in life, but in this absolute expenditure, that with every kind of investment in life, there must also be this expenditure, this kind of anti-economy of death. So Bataille establishes a correlation among death, sovereignty, and sexuality. Sexuality is inextricably linked to violence and to the dissolution of the boundaries of the body and self by way of orgiastic and excremental impulses. So sexuality is also central to colonization, and rape is central to colonization, and it involves crossing a boundary. As such, sexuality concerns two major forms of polarized human impulses, excretion and appropriation, as well as the regime of the taboos surrounding them. The truth of sex and its deadly attributes reside in the experience of loss of the boundaries separating reality, events, and fantasized objects. The Indian Act is not just an act that was passed in paperwork. It also really sets the kind of tone for settler colonialism, and when one looks at it, it is really about rape, sex, and death. The use of kind of categorization of who could or could not claim indigeneity or entitled to land because of sex and who indigenous women had sex with um, is really expressive of the relationship between rape and seizure of land. Uh, so I would argue that the politics of life and death in cases of sterilization and abortion um, are central to uh, nation building and to colonization in Canada. And I think that national identity and the ways that new settlers are born and the kind of affective attachments we have to children in Canada can never be separate from settler colonialism. So I'll finish there. Do you have questions regarding the readings thus far or regarding the test? Do you have any questions or comments as well regarding obstetric violence? It's a really heavy topic. Hope that it wasn't upsetting to anyone, or hope that it is useful information. The Dobbs ruling, I think, is really interesting for us to think about in Canada, or for people in Canada to think about, and hopefully Canada will continue to have a strong movement for reproductive justice. You will be asked to answer 5 short answer questions. So you will be given 8 concepts, I believe 8, and then you can choose 5. And you will be asked to answer those concepts or to define these concepts in short answer format. The take-home will be distributed, on the 30th. It won't be until the 30th for this class. The other class they teach is the 23rd. Next week we'll have a test, but you will have longer because it's a more upper year level class, so you'll have more time. There won't be a word count. You're just asked to answer each question with a minimum of 1 paragraph. 1 paragraph is usually like a minimum of 3 sentences, and there's no maximum. Okay, so I'll end the class there because I have another class that I teach after this, and some of you are also in the other class. So thank you very much, and please email me or contact me if you have any further questions about the assignments or any of the readings or course content. Thank you. Thank you very much for your participation.